excited that you're here with us, whether in person or on our Facebook live stream. Welcome, good morning, happy Sunday. Why don't you stand up and say good morning to somebody around you as we start in worship this morning. Hi. Good morning. Hi. Daddy.
Good morning, Alive Church. It is so good to see everybody here this morning. And even you people online, it's good to see you too. Few brief announcements today here. One of them is life groups are going on. They are Tuesdays at 10:30 in the morning and at 6:30 p.m. And for all you guys who like to eat breakfast, we have a men's group that meets at 8 a.m. on all of our Wednesdays. You guys have probably noticed that there's Christmas decorations out in all the stores now. And I wanted to let you know, for those of you who love planning to decorate the church on Christmas, we're moving it this year. It's not the Saturday right after Thanksgiving. We're going to do it on a Wednesday evening, which means there's no excuse for all of you not to be here. So that'll be on December 1st, Wednesday at 5 p.m. We'll be doing that. On Thursday the 18th, our Young at Heart ministry will have a speaker here talking about organizing and how to declutter your lives. And the last but most important announcement is get ready for the Kids Spot.
Whoa, hey, you guys are just a little bit early. Hey, how are you all doing? I bet you wonder what I'm doing. Well, what I'm doing is air drumming. You know, like, what is air drumming? Well, you get yourself a pair of these and you get the tune going real loud in your head and you just start drumming. It helps you have a lot of Halloween candy, and you feel all good. Yeah, and you're just drumming away. It's just so awesome. And I've been drumming in the air since I was, a teenager. And one of my favorite bands to drum to is a band called Rush. And they got this one song, it's just so awesome. And the music kind of comes down, there's this little quiet part, and then there's the guy sings, and the meek shall inherit the earth. Oh, and it just goes crazy. It just goes crazy. And that brings us to our text today. We're in the Beatitudes, and today our text is this: Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. You know, and kind of like a song, a line in a song, we just skim over. What does it mean? Sometimes we just got to say, hey, stop. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down, right? We got to what's going on here, right? And so when I think of this, I see three words: blessing, meek, inheritance. Blessing, whoa, cool stuff, right? Inheritance, wow, that's really, really, really important. The word that we had trouble with is this whole meek thing, right? We think of meek in not a good way. It sort of seems negative, oh, he's meek. That's like putting someone down, right? And so I'm thinking to myself in my brain, and what would be an excellent example of someone being meek? And then I'm like, bing, the light goes on. I go, of course, it's Jesus. Remember when he was in front of Pontius Pilate being accused, and at any time he could have just said something, and then they drag him out. They just we know everything that happened, right? And then nail and all that stuff, right? But at any time, this is Jesus, who is 100% God and 100% man. He could have called legions, which is a whole bunch of angels, and he could have called the Air Force in, and cats and dogs and atomic bombs and all these things, and none of that would have happened. But he didn't. He was quiet. He was meek. But you see, I think sometimes we get confused about that word meek. And I'm really happy we're talking about it, because Jesus says that those who are meek are blessed, and that those who are meek receive an inheritance. I don't want to miss God's blessing. And I don't want to miss God's inheritance. And so I hope this week is we're going to explore this word, meek. And more than just listen and hear, that we live. So, all right. But I got to get going. I got a couple more minutes before we go downstairs. I'm going to finish up this song. All right. This is Joe signing out. I'll see you next week. Bam, 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 bam. Can I stop, Matt?
To connect kids downstairs. Got our helpers there waiting at the door. And we're going to do our call to worship now. It comes out of Philippians 2:21, which says this: for everyone that looks out for his own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. And St. Augustine says, there can only be two kinds of love: the love of God unto the forgetfulness of self, or the love of self unto the forgetfulness of God. And if he mentions that there were opposite ends of the spectrum, honestly, I'd probably put myself on most days closer to the love of self than the love of God. And that is a struggle. We can get so wrapped up in our calendars, in our plans, our hobbies, our families, work, that we can often neglect to think about the Lord first. And if we're not thinking about Him and devoting meditation time to Him, how can we possibly demonstrate our love for Him well? Our culture idolizes the love of self. In 2019, Google reported that over 93 million selfies were taken. And if we're not paying attention, we can inadvertently go with the flow with that selfie, self-love only culture until our love for God disappears downstream. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't take care of our bodies and we don't take care of our minds and we don't love ourselves, because we do love. God gave it to us. God gave us our bodies in this earth, and we are to take care of them. We are to take care of them and love them as He would. But we are not to idolize them. So how can we escape this? How do we divert this? The Apostle Paul wants to rescue us in his writing. He says, our love of self is an attitude, and he wants to awaken us to the interests of Jesus Christ. Paul was a prisoner in Rome, and he was very concerned about the Philippians when he was writing this. So much so that he wanted to send one of his fellow believers to check on the church's welfare. Unfortunately, Paul couldn't find anyone willing to make the trip on his behalf. No one, that is, except for Timothy. We don't know why others were unavailable. Maybe they were too busy. Maybe it didn't fit their schedule. Maybe they had family plans. But whatever the case, Paul commends Timothy as someone who faithfully demonstrates his concerns for the things of Jesus. He says, I have no one else like him, Timothy, who takes a genuine interest in your welfare. Timothy has proved himself and has served with me in the work of the gospel. Timothy stood out for loving God and for loving others, in contrast to most believers probably in the area. Timothy's life centered around the interests of Jesus, which was reaching more people with the gospel. He shows us a perfect example of love of God lifestyle, where our plans do not become more important than God's plans. Our schedule is not more important than God's schedule, even though we tend to switch those in our brains. So we have two takeaways. Put others first and put faith into action. Timothy's faith wasn't a matter of talk, but of action. He didn't merely give lip service about traveling to Philippi. He made the journey. Time and time again, he proved himself and worked for the gospel, it says in Philippians 2:22. Could these things be said about us? Are we making the journey? Are we putting our faith into action? God, just as Timothy did, grant us such a deep love for you that we would put our faith into action to spread the gospel. God, make new things out of us. Transform us out of our self-absorbed selves into beacons of light of you, God. Help us to further the kingdom for your sake. Put aside our own goals, our old schedules, our own plans. Help us focus on your plans, God, and trust that when we can't even figure out what those are, that you will provide a way for us, and that your plan and your will be done. Amen. As we enter into this time of worship, again, we have these beautiful pieces of artwork up here. I implore you to come down and look at them throughout our worship, because we want to honor more than one way of worshiping. Not everybody just wants to sing, and not everybody has that as worship for them. So I implore you to come down and look at these amazing pieces of worship here that Amanda has created for us today as we sing these songs. And you're welcome to stand as well.
All this pain, I wonder if I'll ever find my way. I wonder if my life could really change at all. All this hurt, could all that is lost ever be found? Could a garden come up from this ground at all? You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of dust. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of us. believe in you. I believe in you. 'Cause you're the God of miracles. Who dies impossible is reaching out to make me whole, reaching out to make me whole. The one who put death in its place, his life is flowing through my veins, his life is flowing through my veins, and I believe in you. I believe in you, 'cause you're the God of miracles. And I believe in you, I believe in you, you're the God of miracles. God was and is to come. The power of the risen one. The God who brings the dead to life. You're the God of miracles. You're the God of miracles. God who was and is to come. The power of the risen one. The God who brings the dead to life. You're the God of miracles. You're the God of miracles. And I believe in you. I believe in you. 'Cause you're the God of miracles. And I believe in you. I believe in you. You're the God of miracles. Oh, I believe in you. 'Cause I believe in you. You're the God of miracles. I believe in you. Yes, I believe in you. You're the God of miracles. I believe in you. I believe in you. You're the God of miracles. I believe in you. I believe in you. You're the God of miracles.
You know, as we get ready to pray today, I was thinking about what Joe said earlier, and he talked about the meek inheriting the earth. And I have a friend of mine who likes to talk a lot about how upside down God's kingdom is, and the fact that the Jews, when Jesus came, were expecting a leader. They were expecting a soldier who would come in and slay the Romans. And Jesus said, no, that's not what it's about. And one of the things that's always struck me about being a Christian ever since I accepted Jesus is the fact that everything is backwards compared to the world. And in the world, we want strong leaders. We want them to show us how to fight. And Jesus said, no. least shall become the most. And I just love the fact that being a Christian is really about serving. It's about how can God use you. And one of the most amazing things is he never uses us in our strength. He always finds something in our life that we really struggled with. And then that's where we help others. And I'd just like to pray for our service this morning. Jesus, thank you that you use us out of our weakness. Thank you that we can identify people who really are Christians by how they serve and not how they yell and talk about others. And Jesus, I just thank you for every person that's here this morning. I thank you that you have called us here as part of your upside-down kingdom. And Lord, I think Ben's going to tell us some more about that right now. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
There's this beautiful poem. It's in the book of Isaiah.
The city of Jerusalem has just been destroyed by Babylon, a great kingdom in the north. And all of these
There's this beautiful poem. It's in the book of Isaiah.
The city of Jerusalem has just been destroyed by Babylon, a great kingdom in the north. And all of these Jewish people, they've been sent away into exile, but a few remained in the city. And they're left wondering, what just happened? Has our God abandoned us?
Right, because Jerusalem was supposed to be the city where God would reign over the world to bring peace and blessing to everyone.
Now, Isaiah had been saying that Jerusalem's destruction was a mess of Israel's own making. They had turned away from their God, become corrupt, and so their city and their temple were destroyed.
Yeah, everything seems lost.
But the poem goes on. There's a watchman on the city walls. And far out on the hills, we see a messenger, and he's running towards the city. He's running and he's shouting, "Good news!" And Isaiah says, "How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news."
Beautiful feet?
Yes, the feet are beautiful because they're carrying a beautiful message.
What's the message?
That despite Jerusalem's destruction, Israel's God still reigns as king, and that God himself is going to one day return to this city, take up his throne, and bring peace.
And the watchmen sing for joy because of the good news that their God still reigns.
Now, in the New Testament, we find this same phrase, the good news. It's the Greek word euangelion, and it's also sometimes translated with the word gospel.
Yeah, so when Christians say, "Do you believe the gospel?" they mean, do you believe the news?
But not just any news. In the Bible, this phrase is always about the announcement of the reign of a new king. And in the New Testament, the Gospels use this phrase to summarize all of Jesus' teachings. They say that he went about proclaiming the good news of God's kingdom.
So Jesus saw himself as the messenger, bringing the news that God reigns.
Yes, but the way that he described God's reign, it surprised everybody. I mean, think, a powerful, successful kingdom. It needs to be strong, able to impose its will, able to defeat its enemies. But Jesus said the greatest person in God's kingdom was the weakest, the one who loves and who serves the poor. And he said that you live under God's reign when you respond to evil by loving your enemies and forgiving them and seeking peace. This is an upside-down kingdom.
Now, Jesus also said that this kingdom was arriving with him.
Yeah, so for example, there's this really interesting story where there's a high-ranking Roman officer, and he comes to Jesus begging him to heal his servant. And he even calls Jesus his Lord, acknowledging that Jesus is his authority. Jesus praises this man for recognizing what no one else yet had, that not only was Jesus announcing God's kingdom, he was the king.
And so the word gets out that this Jewish man from Galilee is talking and acting like he's the king of Israel. He's appointing 12 disciples, which are an image of Israel's 12 tribes. He's healing people, forgiving people their sins.
And all of this so threatened Israel's leaders that they finally decide to have him killed. And Jesus let them.
Yeah, which is a weird thing to do if you're trying to become king.
That's right. But for Jesus, This is what had to happen. Jesus saw the sin and the devastation of his people Israel as just one small part of the entire human condition. How all humanity has rebelled against God, resulting in the tragedy and devastation of our whole world. And so how is God going to bring his reign over such a world? Jesus believed it would be through an act of sacrificial love for his enemies. This is why in the Gospels, Jesus' crucifixion is depicted as his enthronement as the King of the Jews.
Yeah, he receives a crown. He also receives a robe.
He's exalted up, not onto a throne, but onto the cross.
How beautiful are the feet that bring good news.
And the good news now is that Jesus has defeated death and that he reigns as king, that he's dealt with our sin and corruption himself, and that he's conquered it with his life and with his love.
And then Jesus sends his followers to go out and keep announcing this good news of the upside-down kingdom.
And to invite everyone to give their allegiance to him, the king who defeated death with his love.
I want to talk today about a kingdom. And I'm not the first one to talk about it today. I'm so thankful that we have so many amazing preachers in our community. We had Joe preaching exactly what I'm hoping to talk about today. Salem brought the word. She was preaching. Tony, thank you for sharing. You were preaching. So I'm so thankful that it's not just my voice or Phil's voice or Ronald's voice or Salem's voice that we're hearing. We get so many beautiful voices and words that are so important in our community. But I'd like to continue in the same theme that I think everyone else has been hitting. I want to talk about a kingdom. This kingdom, it doesn't have any tall towers or large castles with big moats filled with alligators. That's kind of my archetype of a kingdom when I was a kid. It was like every kingdom has a moat and there's a lot of alligators, and I thought that was going to be a bigger issue in my adult life than it ended up being. But anyways, it's not one of those kingdoms. This kingdom doesn't have any dashing knights in shining or plate armor or anything. They don't have tournaments with jousting and turkey legs. None of that is the kingdom that I'm talking about. And if you came looking for that kind of kingdom, I'm sorry, but you might be a little bit disappointed. And honestly, if you were disappointed, you wouldn't be the first person to be disappointed. This kingdom has surprised a lot of people in a negative way. Lots of people have come to this kingdom looking for power or permission for revenge, but left only with peace. Many people have come to this kingdom looking for an army and found that they didn't really have one. Many people have come looking for titles, working hard for land, for power, and found only humility at the end of their road. Many have come to this kingdom looking for war and have been sorely disappointed. But this kingdom isn't only a letdown for everyone. It's not a letdown for everyone in every place. In fact, it seems that it lets down the people who prosper in a normal kingdom, but it prospers the people who are let down by a normal kingdom. It's sort of upside down like that. This kingdom raises the least of human society into the highest places of its hierarchy. This kingdom wins wars by never fighting them in the first place. This kingdom is ruled by a man who saved the world by being humble. This kingdom is ruled by a man who loves his enemies and asks his subjects to do the same. This kingdom is ruled by a man who was born into the margins of the world. This kingdom asks us to follow the example of its ruler. In this kingdom, the low already and will yet become high. The least are the greatest. This kingdom has wide open gates for immigrants who need much and have nothing to offer in return. This kingdom operates on economics that don't really make any sense. In order to find what you need, you must first lose everything you have. In Jesus' upside-down kingdom, the blind are welcome, but the rich seem to turn away. In Jesus' upside-down kingdom, the powerful and the influential disregard and ignore the invitation from its ruler to feast and to be one. And in this kingdom, those without homes are asked to build the culture. Those without family are asked to provide for each other. And those without protection are cared for. This kingdom elevates the voice of the low. It magnifies the experience of the marginalized, and all its heroes are those who are despised by other kingdoms. But not only are this kingdom's gates wide open for the lowly, the oppressed, the marginalized, and the abandoned, this kingdom is rejected by the powerful or by the rich, by the oppressor, and often by the complacent. I want to be clear, it's not so much that they're not welcome, it's more that they seem to not be willing to walk through the same gate as the lame, the blind, the beggar, or the diseased. You see, this kingdom welcomes the oppressor, but only if they're willing to lay down the weapons and the systems that they used to oppress the creation of God. Whichever demographic you find yourself in, whether it's the oppressed or the oppressor, you are invited to participate and partake in this kingdom today. How might you answer the call? Our beatitude, as we've mentioned a couple times already today, for this week, it comes out of Matthew 5:5. It says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." And I need to be really honest, this is not my favorite passage. This is one of my least favorite beatitudes because I'm not a terribly meek person. Have you met me? That's not who I am. I have a lot of strong opinions, and I love making them known. I like to try and be a little bit contrarian and weird, and it's incredible, and I like it. But it doesn't seem to fit with the call that Jesus is placing before us today. And to be clear, meekness, I don't believe that meekness is the exclusive purview of the weak. You can be meek whether you're weak or strong, whether you have power or not. It's just that meekness seems to come easier to those in the world who have been told that they're worthless. It's easier for those who have little to act as if they have nothing. It's easier for those broken down by the boots of society to stop looking for their own way or grasping for their own things. Meekness in the face of oppression isn't terribly complicated, and in that sense, God's kingdom values are upside down because it invites those considered to be worthless or bad stewards to take ownership of the entire land, the known world now and forever. And we discussed last week, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but what I mentioned last week is that I kind of see in myself, I check every box of what privilege in the United States is, being white, being a man, being straight, all of those sorts of things. So meekness doesn't come easily to me. I'm used to getting what I want. I'm used to only needing to have the courage to take what I consider to be due to me, but that's not meekness. What does meekness look like for me? To explain that, I'd like to quote a couple commentaries of people smarter than I, Bible commentaries. So one says, true meekness may be the quality of the strong, those who could assert themselves but choose not to do so. The strong who qualify for this blessing are the strong who decline to domineer. Self-assertion is never a Christian virtue. Rather, it is Christian to be busy in lowly service and to refuse to engage in the conduct that merely advances one's personal aims. Another commentary says, to be meek is to restrain one's privilege for the sake of others. And yet another one says, gentleness or meekness is the opposite of self-assertiveness and self-interest. It stems from trust in God's goodness and control over the situation. The gentle person is not occupied with self at all. This is the work of the Holy Spirit, not of the human will. And this, I believe, is the kingdom that I'm being invited into. It's upside down because it elevates the oppressed. But that doesn't mean that the powerful and the privileged aren't invited. It's just that we might not always be willing to walk through the same gate as those we oppress or despise. My favorite example of this comes from a writing by C.S. Lewis It's called The Great Divorce. He writes a book, he writes a story. It's a work of fiction, but in this work of fiction, he kind of imagines a possibility for what heaven and hell looks like. He's explicitly said this is not a theological work. Don't base your faith on what he's said, but it's a really cool exercise, and I think that there's a piece in it in particular that would do a great job of illustrating the point that I'm making today. But first, some backstory. In the Great Divorce, there are two places. One is where you go right after death, which we are meant to consider as a sort of like purgatory or hell kind of place. And depending on whether you stay or not, it's one or not or the other. And there are some people that have been there for a long time. But also, there's a bus. And this bus takes everyone who wants to this other place, which we are to consider to be heaven. The narrator of our story that we follow in this whole time, they get on that bus that goes to heaven, and after a series of events that are pretty fantastical and wild, I encourage you to read this story. It's really cool. I love it. After all those events, they overhear a conversation happening between one person who also recently died and is visiting this place we are to consider heaven, and another person who died a long time ago, and they've taken up permanent residence in this place. So after that poor summarization of a really complex and fantastical story, I will continue by poorly paraphrasing that conversation. Read it yourself. I would really encourage you. It's really good. And essentially, in this conversation, what I understand is that this recently deceased visitor looks around him, takes stock of the whole place, and says, "No, this isn't heaven. I would know because I was a clergy person. I know in my head exactly what heaven will look like, who will be here, and right now what I'm seeing is not that. This is not heaven. In fact, I think that place that I was at before is closer to what my vision of what heaven was. So I'd like to go back now, please." And the resident is saying, no, I promise you, this is heaven. This is the place that we were promised, that we dreamed about when we were friends. And the older guy says, no, you're wrong. You died when you were young, so you don't really understand how the world works. But I know how the world works, and I know how heaven works, and this isn't it. I'm going back. And they take the bus back to the place they wanted to be. And this work by Lewis, and in particular this conversation, was very formational for me for one reason, and that interaction summarizes that formational aspect for me. And to really summarize it, I want to read a direct quote from The Great Divorce, where Lewis says, "There are only two kinds of people in the end. One, those who say to God, 'Thy will be done,' and two, those whom God says to them, 'In the end, thy will be done.' All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find. Those who knock, it is opened." Now, I have to be clear again in saying that this particular stance is not the only possible way to look at how heaven and hell works, and I'm not here to debate the theology of that. I'm merely trying to illustrate the point of please do not let your preconceived notion of how heaven and God's kingdom works keep you from submitting to God and telling him, "Your will be done." Because this is meekness for those who are strong. Everyone is invited into Jesus' upside down kingdom, but you have to be willing to become meek, to become the least, or at least to become so indiscernibly in solidarity with those who are considered the least that you're comfortable walking through that same gate as the deceased, the diseased, the downtrodden, the immigrant, and the orphan. I have one last little call for us, but right now I'd like to invite the worship team to come back up. And we're going to try something. And I don't know how many of you know this term, but we're going to try what's called an altar call. And an altar call is really exciting for people in the holiness stream, kind of that Methodist Wesleyan, our denomination that we come from, because that was so important to us in the beginnings of our kind of stream of faith. What an altar call is simply an invitation to either physically or mentally, come to the front, kneel or stand, or make a very physical declaration that you'd like to join in with what I'm talking about. I'm going to read to you just a real quick final invitation to the upside down kingdom of God. And if this is something that you have been a part of before and want to continue being a part of, I encourage you to come down, do the altar call, come and affirm that even as you continue to learn more and more and more and more about what the kingdom is, you want to continue to meet that threshold. That's one of the beautiful things about how, at least I understand Christian perfection. Christian perfection is you know what you have to do and you do it. And then all of a sudden you are older and you're smarter and you learn more about what you have to do and you do the best you can with everything you can to meet that. And then you learn more and you meet that threshold. And this is what it is. And I encourage you to take a physical step to say, yes, I want to continue doing that in my life now. Or maybe you're someone who has not really heard about this kingdom before. You're someone who has actively rejected this kingdom before, and you'd like to kind of change your stance on that. And again, I'd invite you to either come up physically or mentally or in spirit and just affirm, this is something that I want to journey in. I want to learn more about this upside down kingdom and this king who died instead of winning a war. So let me make an invitation. Don't you want to be a part of this kingdom? Don't you want to walk under the banner of the king who leads from behind, who rides donkeys instead of war horses, who dies rather than kills? Do you want to join the work of the saints of his kingdom, who have for years and years and years said to God, "Thy will be done and not mine"? Who submit themselves to the betterment of everyone who is being trodden down by the kingdoms of this world. If you'd like to affirm that with me, I invite you to come up while we're singing.
All this pain, I want to forever find my way. I want to
over you a benediction which says, "The ruler of the upside down kingdom has invited us all into his domain." Will we accept the invitation by becoming meek, by restraining any privilege we have for others? I invite you today and tomorrow and every tomorrow after that to live into the reality of Jesus' upside down kingdom where the meek inherit the earth. And with that, you are sent out. Have a beautiful day and a beautiful week.
You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of time. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful